Good morning. Hey, let's talk about the book of Daniel today. Anybody here named Daniel, by the way? No? That's good. If we're not talking about you if your name's Daniel, just throwing that out there. I'm talking about Daniel, the Jewish prophet who lived some 700 years before the birth of Christ. Daniel was the victim of the Babylonian exile, meaning he was part of a group of Israelis that were forced into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar. Here's the deal. Daniel was destined to stand out and get noticed. That's not always a good thing. Trust me, I know. I'm an ex-Army. I had the great pleasure of joining the U.S. Army when I was the ripe old age of 27. The hows and why I joined at that late stage of life is another story. But in a nutshell, I was unwilling to grow too old to do something that I'd always wanted to do. So I ended up joining the Army and going to basic. Now there's one absolute truth in basic, and it's that you always strive to be the unknown soldier. The unknown soldier didn't get noticed, it was a soldier that didn't get noticed by the drill sergeants. Soldiers that did not get noticed by the drill sergeants didn't do as many push-ups. That's a verifiable statistical fact. Here's the deal though. At 27, I was about 10 years older than the average recruit coming into basic. Try to be the unknown soldier when A, you're 10 years older than the average recruit, B, you have a college degree when most of these guys barely got out of high school, and C, you're a bit of a wise guy with poor impulse control. I got noticed. I got noticed a lot. Translation, my upper arm strength was quite impressive by the time I got done with basic. And in some ways, I was stronger because I stood out. Daniel would have had a rough time in basic. Daniel stood out. I'd argue all day long that Daniel was stronger because he chose to stand out. Now, before we dive into chapter 1, let me give you a bit more of the backstory so you understand where all of this stuff is coming from. A Babylonian king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar has just conquered Jerusalem. He came in and in biblical terms, he kicked butt and took names. By the way, don't you love the name Nebuchadnezzar? Anybody here name their kids Nebuchadnezzar? There's a reason none of us name our kids Nebuchadnezzar. It's too hard to spell. It's too hard to pronounce. And Nebuchadnezzar, let's face it, wasn't a nice guy. Not only did Nebuchadnezzar destroy Jerusalem, but he burned and looted their temple. Not only did King Nebuchadnezzar destroy Jerusalem and burn and loot their temple, but he attempted to destroy the future of the Jewish people as well. What do I mean? King Nebuchadnezzar instructed his generals to go and find the sharpest and the brightest young sons of the Jewish royalty and nobles, the future of Israel, and bring them to Babylon. In Babylon, they'd be taught Babylonian culture, Babylonian food, Babylonian gods. They were going to be trained to serve our good buddy King Nebuchadnezzar. Understand Nebi's plan here, his nefarious plan. Not only did he destroy Jerusalem's present, but he, by conquering them and burning the city and smashing the temple, but he was intent on destroying Jerusalem's future as well. He did this by taking the best of the best and the brightest of Jerusalem's sons, the people who would have led Jerusalem and Israel, had Babylon never come and conquered Jerusalem and attempted to beat them. So not at all like Putin, by the way, going into Ukraine and kidnapping hundreds of kids and hauling them off to Russia for re-education. And so that's the backstory. Let's look at verses 3 through 5 of chapter 1 of Daniel and tear them apart and see what we can learn, to apply to our lives today. And then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring to the king's service some of the Israelites, the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome and showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Let me read that piece of Daniel again. I want you to see how these pieces fit together. It's easy to read these things and gloss over in your mind what's being said and why it's being said. So again, this is Daniel 1, verses 3 through 5. The king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome and showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. In other words, go find those that are the best and the brightest. Those are the ones that I want. It goes on to say he was to teach them the language. In other words, I want them to speak like we speak. And the literature of the Babylonians. In other words, I want them to think like we think. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Now, this is important, and we're going to come back to this piece. I want them to eat from the king's table. Then they're to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they're to enter the king's service. There's an interesting parallel here. Jesus took 3 years to train his disciples. It takes 3 years to properly transform a person. That was the goal here. Make no mistake. What I want you to notice is that this was a very intentional and strategic plan to indoctrinate these young boys into Babylonian culture. He being, Nebi the king, wanted these sons of Israel to blend in. This is what makes the book of Daniel so powerful. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the people of God to blend in. Daniel, as we see, was a true man of God, and as a result, he insisted on standing out. Or even Nebuchadnezzar was impressed by Daniel and the strength of his faith because of the way Daniel chose to stand out. Now, this makes a great story. I enjoy reading it, but let's be honest. Why should I care? Why does Daniel's story from hundreds of years before the birth of Christ make a difference to Andrew Beery living in 2023? Why should it matter to me, and why should it matter to you? The simple answer is Daniel sets an example for us. We have a spiritual enemy who wants nothing more than for us to blend in, like Nebuchadnezzar wanted his Jewish captives to blend in. Satan would like nothing more than for each of us to become Babylonians in our hearts, to blend in. He'd like nothing better than for us to worship the false gods of home and boat and cabin and career and materialism and culture and a godless worldview. Our spiritual enemy does not want us to be standout Christians. He wants us to blend in. Here's the sad thing. There are a lot of us Christians who are far happier blending in than standing out. I'd even go so far as to make the argument that it's completely impossible to be a blend-in Christian and have any spiritual success in the world, at least in my book. It's completely impossible to be what some call a cultural Christian and have spiritual success. You might say, what's a cultural Christian? Well, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. They're the people who would answer the questions, do you believe in God? With something like, well, yeah, I believe in God. Are you a Christian? Well, yeah. Yeah, I'm a Christian. I mean, it's not like I'm something else. I go to church on Easter and the big holidays like that. And of course, I was born to parents who were Christians. I inherited it, I guess. So yeah, I'm a Christian. All the passion of a dead frog smashed on the side of the road, flat and not smelling so good. Is there any outward sign that you're a Christian? Well, I'm a good person. I try hard. Of course, I mean, it's not like I'm religious like some of those weirdo people, but yeah, you know what I mean. Some people, they take it too seriously. Yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm a good Christian, a cultural Christian. This is like saying I work out one day a year and I'm in shape. I don't even work out one day a year, just throwing that out there. It's like saying I eat one string bean and I'm a healthy eater. Forget all those supersized fries or milkshakes or that single serving large pizza. I'm a healthy eater. Cultural Christianity is not standout Christianity. We're going to learn from Daniel that you've got to make the presence of God a priority in your life. Where you seek Him, where you depend on Him, where you're living and dwelling in His Word, where it's feeding you, where it's renewing your mind, where you're learning to walk by faith and not by sight, where you're hearing His Spirit guide you. You cannot be a just sort of, just kinda Christian and have the God-filled life that Christ wants you to have. In fact, that's why Paul says in Ephesians 6, verses 11 and 13, he says, put on the full armor of God so that you can do what? So you can take your stand. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and the belt of truth, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. Sometimes you have to take a stand for that which matters most in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. You know, one of the pastors that I was reading as I was preparing this sermon said this. He said, I would submit to you that if you are never standing out, you're always blending in, then you're not truly committed to following Jesus. Because when you follow Him, you will be different. You will be set apart. Those are harsh words. This word holy means sanctified. It means to be set apart. Be holy as I am holy, God says. Stand out. Let's look at Daniel chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 as the story goes on. Among those who were chosen from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. To Azariah, Abednego. Now, why did they change their names? Because their original names were all tied to the worship of Yahweh, the one true God. Their new names tied them to pagan, Babylonian gods. For example, Daniel in Hebrew means, Yahweh is my judge. God is my judge. Belteshazzar means God is protect the king. All their new names were tied to the worship of the Babylonian pagan gods. So and essentially every time someone called you by your new name, there was a reminder that you were supposed to serve these pagan gods. Every time somebody says your name, oh yeah, you don't serve Yahweh anymore, you serve these other gods. They didn't stop with changing the names. They changed their diet. They were to eat the food that was prepared for the king. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm thinking that sounds pretty good to me. Kings don't typically eat bad. Here's the problem. This food, this meat and wine were dedicated to pagan gods. They were in no way kosher. This created a problem for Daniel and his friends because they wanted to honor and worship Yahweh in every way possible. And to eat or drink, put into their bodies anything that was dedicated to pagan gods would be crossing a line, a Rubicon, if you will, in their minds, and it would be disrespectful to God. So verse 8 is probably the key verse to everything we're going to be looking at today. Verse 8 says this, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself. He resolved not to defile himself with royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. I want you to notice this. Daniel did not fight back when his name was taken. Why? I'm guessing it's because he's thinking, hey, you can call me whatever you want. You can tie me to whatever God you want with a name. I know who I am. I know who my true name is. Any outward name doesn't define who I am in my heart. I will always worship and always know and always serve my God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, the very same God we experience in the person of Jesus. Daniel was saying that Daniel's name was not worth fighting for. But look at what he did fight for. He took a stand when God would be defamed, when God's temple, the body of the believer, would have been defiled with pagan food on the inside. Insult me all you want, but do not insult my God. He could have done what all the other Jewish boys were doing. Eat the king's food, let's have a party. This is good stuff. But here's the key. He had predetermined. He had resolved in his heart ahead of time. He had made a decision before he was faced with the temptation to do what was right. And I'd argue all day long, for those of you that are followers of Christ, your success in so many different spiritual endeavors will be determined by what you decide to do ahead of time. You need to decide now that no matter what happens in the future, you pre-decided to serve God. You pre-decided to honor God. You pre-decided to honor your commitment and your love for God. Means because of what you've pre-decided in your heart to do to honor God, you will occasionally have to stand out. You're going to have to do the hard work of being that a boatload of push-ups or getting muddy serving God by serving your neighbor. If you're never standing out and you're always blending in, then maybe you're not fully following Christ. That's what Daniel and his friends did. They resolved in their hearts not to eat the food that had been dedicated to pagan gods. Now, don't lose track of the magnitude of what's happening here. Daniel and his friends were committing to stand out day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out. For breakfast, they stood out. At lunch, they stood out. At dinner, they stood out. The next day, they stood out. And again and again and again. They made one decision that set them apart again and again and again. And if you're fully following Christ, you're going to find the closer you get to Him, the more you're going to stand out. And folks, that's a good thing. Watch the wisdom of Daniel, chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. Daniel says this to the chief official. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, he says, hey, here's the deal. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, hey, here's the deal. As I said, I'm paraphrasing. Hey, here's the deal. I don't want to eat this food, but let me try an experiment. Just please, let's test it for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and drink. Vegetables and water to eat and drink. In other words, we're not eating that meat or that wine that's been dedicated to pagans. Just give us water and vegetables. Verse 13, then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat us your servants in accordance with what you see. Verse 14, so the government leader agreed to do this and tested them for 10 days. Verse 15, at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who ate the royal food. Now, this is the part that I love. Instead of making a big protest, with wisdom, they presented a plan. Hey, can we simply try something else? I think you're going to like what happens. So let's jump to verse 18. We see this. Verse 18. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked to them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and as they entered the king's service. In fact, we learn in the next verses or so that they were considered 10 times more capable than their peers, and not just their peers, but anyone in the kingdom. It turns out God gave them the ability to interpret dreams and visions and the like. We'll learn the next time we get together in the book of Daniel that they literally redirected the course of history because they stood up for what mattered most. Think about this. Had Daniel compromised his values, had Daniel not had the courage to stand out, nothing historic would have happened. The history of the Jewish nation that they shaped would not have happened. There'd be no book of Daniel in the Bible. I don't know about you, but with all of my heart, I would rather be remembered for standing out for my Christian values than to be forgotten for blending in. Does that make sense? Daniel sets an example for us in many ways. The depth and the sincerity and the self-sacrificing nature of his faith foreshadows the depth and the sincerity and the self-sacrificing nature of Jesus. That's why we should care about this story in Daniel. That's why it's important to us. It sets the example for our lives. We can be in our own way Daniel and stand out for our beliefs, stand out for Christ. Let's pray. Father in heaven, hear our prayers. May you give us the courage of Daniel to stand out bravely for what we know to be right and just in your eyes. May our Christian witness stand out in a world filled with Nebuchadnezzars. Predetermining to stand out when needed takes a strength few of us have on our own. May you empower us to be faith-filled, bet-the-farm risk takers, never insulting you, Lord, with safe living or small thinking. May the love of Christ abide in all of us, so that by the examples of our lives, we may show the world what it is to be a Christian. Amen.